Hello, my name's Marcos Patchett, the Nocturnal Herbalist, and this video is all about cannabis, just a general overview of medicinal cannabis, what it's useful for, what it's not useful for, from a medical herbalist perspective. It's pharmacology, so how it works, how cannabis does what it does medicinally. Contraindications, so when not to use medicinal cannabis, and this is important. Then moving on to its use in cancer. So we'll start by looking at the symptoms it might be useful to help treat. Then we'll move on to its potential usefulness alongside conventional therapy, that's chemotherapy or radiotherapy. And finally, I'll address its use as a standalone cancer treatment or a cancer treatment in conjunction with conventional therapy. And of course, this is the thing that's really sort of hit the internet equivalent of whatever headlines are, and people seem to be under the impression a lot of the time, at least a lot of my clients have been, that they can just take cannabis, some form of cannabis, and there's a lot of confusion about what form to use, and it'll treat their cancer. So I'm going to really go into that in some detail and start looking at I'm just looking at my notes here, start looking at the evidence for and against any effects in cancer, in different types of cancer, and then move on finally to different types of cannabis that can be used and different dosages. And last but not least, I'm just going to add on a little bit about the metaphysics, because I like all that. It's non-sciencey, but the astrology of cannabis for anyone who's interested. So there's going to be a whole bunch of science with some magical stuff at the end. A brief word on the obvious, which I haven't mentioned yet, the legality of cannabis. I'm not endorsing the illegal use of cannabis. It's just a fact that it is illegal. It's still illegal in the UK, although there are now preparations of medicinal cannabis that are legally available, but they are sort of semi-synthetic versions, which are in some cases almost as good as the real thing. Almost. Not quite. I'll get onto the research in a moment. But my personal view, I'm a libertarian. I think all drugs should be legalized. I don't mean by legalized they should just be freely available and handed out in playgrounds. What I mean is legalized with some form of control system in place. So age restrictions, some available through pharmacies, some on prescription, etc. But I think all drugs should be legalized for various reasons, which I won't go into in this video because it's long, but it's just illogical. The whole legal thing surrounding drugs is completely illogical. It just benefits criminals and criminalizes users, which has multiple unfortunate ramifications and long-term effects. And just historically, prohibition actually tends to increase rather than reduce illegal drug use. Not just because the drugs are illegal, but actual consumption of many prohibited drugs tends to decrease when those drugs are made legal, which is very bizarre but true. So if you look for example, the history of the prohibition of alcohol in the United States, there's a clear trend there. The consumption of cannabis in Amsterdam, where it is legal by native Dutch people, is far lower than in other countries in Europe where it's illegal. Anyway, I could go on, I won't. The point is, if you are considering using cannabis, whether for recreation or for medicinal purposes, please do carefully consider the legality of where you are, because you could get yourself into trouble, and that is just adding insult to injury if you're already sick. So just that little, not disclaimer, but that little aside there is important. I just want to start with actually what qualifies me to talk about this. I'm a medical herbalist, which means in the UK I did a 4-year BSc, Bachelor of Sciences degree in herbal medicine from 2001 to 2005 at Middlesex University. Such things do exist in the UK, and that degree includes a lot of basic medical training, so anatomy and physiology, differential diagnosis, not quite up to the level of a doctor, but I would say in some ways slightly more than a nurse, because we studied with nursing students, and a lot of the nursing students did much more practical stuff. They know how to cannulate people and take blood. They're trained in phlebotomy, which we are not, but I would say we probably did a bit more diagnostics, because in practice herbalists have to be a bit like GPs. So although we are not authorized legally to treat things to the same level as a GP can, we have to know how to spot potentially serious pathologies in order to refer them on for further tests, etc. So that's the sort of medical training, and that degree included over 450 hours of clinical training, including placements in orthodox establishments like hospitals and such. Mainly the training was conducted in the university's complementary training clinic, so we were just seeing patients there. We did physical examination like OSCEs, like doctors do. They include just testing blood pressure, cardiovascular examination, abdominal examination, respiratory examination, and so on. So I've basically got some background pertinent to the subject. The herbal medicine degree also included conventional pharmacology, a couple of modules of that, and a couple of modules of pharmacognosy, which is the study of drugs from natural sources, plus of course several modules on herbal therapeutics, which is actually using plants in clinical practice. And there was an emphasis on evidence-based medicine, but also and this is what I love about herbal medicine, a lot of stuff about using traditional knowledge and using those two things alongside each other, and using your common sense and clinical judgment to decide when to use something. There's a lot of art in it. There's a lower degree of proof for herbal medicines than there is for conventional pharmaceutical medicines, because of course a lot of them have been in use for thousands of years. Cannabis is a good example. And so they just don't have the same level of clinical proof because they've already been in use for a very long time. That's not to say that more clinical proof wouldn't be good, because it would be for a lot of herbs. And in fact, when they're put through their paces, it often turns up very useful information in terms of informing and refining practice. Anyway, tangent. That's my background as a herbalist. And then I also worked in a medical cannabis clinic in central London from 2004 till 2007. I started graduating when I finished my third year. I started practicing in that cannabis clinic when I finished my third year of my degree, and worked there till 2007. And then I worked there again briefly for about 9 months in 2013. And in that clinic, my role and the role of the other herbalist there was as a gatekeeper. So I wasn't dispensing the cannabis. My job was to assess new patients and to take a full medical history and to make sure that they were in fact eligible for medical cannabis. And that brings me on to the next portion, or the first bit, which is really the general medical properties of cannabis. So the 5 things we would assess patients on to make sure that they were eligible for cannabis were 5 of the uses that cannabis has been shown to be beneficial for, 5 of the symptoms or problems. The first would be chronic pain. Now, cannabis is particularly good for neurogenic or neuropathic pain. That's pain of nervous origin, so nerve pain, such as following spinal injury or in certain neurological conditions. You can get nerve pain, for example, in multiple sclerosis, spasticity, that kind of thing. Very, very useful for nerve pain and sort of spasms or cramps or spastic symptoms, so that the muscles cramp or flicker and aren't working properly. So it's very useful for those symptoms, basically. That's number 1. Number 2 would be loss of appetite and weight loss, because well-known side effect of cannabis, gives you the munchies, makes you want to eat more, increases your appetite. And tied in with that is nausea. So the category of patients we had either had to have chronic pain, multiple sclerosis, because cannabis is very, very useful for the symptoms of multiple sclerosis. They had to have a diagnosis of cancer, so they were on chemotherapy, which often gave them appetite problems and made them feel sick, for which cannabis is very useful. But the other 2 categories were patients with HIV who had loss of appetite. And I would say that was the majority of the patients. In a lot of cases, I don't think those patients necessarily needed cannabis. It was useful for them, but there are many other herbal agents which are, I would say, more appropriate in HIV for stimulating appetite. And I did, of course, as a herbalist, offer all the new patients herbal treatment instead. The majority, for reasons best known to themselves, selected in most cases to have cannabis instead. I'd say about 25%, 20 to 25%, maybe 7 or 8 out of 10 wanted to try the herbs instead of or as well, but the majority just wanted to sign up for medicinal cannabis. Fair enough, who can blame them? But it does increase appetite. And help weight gain, which of course is a problem in HIV, which often reduces the appetite. Of course, this, when I was practicing there, it was more than 10 years ago, or, you know, for my brief stint in 2013, more than 5 years ago now. So the drugs have improved a lot, and the weight loss symptom, although it's a symptom of HIV, when HIV is properly controlled by medication, tends not to be such a huge feature, but it can be, and cannabis can be useful then. And then the last indication was glaucoma, or raised pressure in the eye. So those are things which cannabis has been found useful for. I'm just going to check my notes. There are a few other things that we didn't give patients cannabis for that we know it can be useful for, and those are epilepsy, particularly some subtypes of epilepsy. There's a childhood type of epilepsy called Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, which is a particularly intractable, meaning difficult to treat, form of epilepsy, which is often highly responsive to cannabis. Around 70% of children in a clinical trial actually got a significant reduction in the number of seizures after using cannabis for that. So if the link to that general trial will be below in the description box, should you be interested in that. It's a whole paper, and there's a section on the sections on the different medicinal uses of cannabis, because it's a paper on the general medical uses of cannabis with fully referenced. It sort of like includes all the compiles all the scientific information on it. So for anyone interested in that, go for it. The link is in the description box below. And if you have or know anyone with epilepsy, particularly any child with that type of epilepsy, then that might be a useful thing to look at, or to send a person who you know. Anyway, the other medical complaints which cannabis can be useful: Tourette syndrome, you know, the sort of spontaneous swearing thing, can be quite helpful for that. Fibromyalgia pain. Pharmacology. When we're talking about cannabis, we're actually talking about 2 or 3 different subtypes of cannabis, 2 or 3 different species. There's Cannabis ruderalis, which is usually referred to by the name hemp, although that name is sometimes used to refer to more powerful forms of cannabis. But hemp usually refers to Cannabis ruderalis, which means a species, or a species of cannabis which is less psychoactive. It has less of an effect on the mind. And I'll get into the pharmacology in a moment. The Cannabis sativa subtype is a little bit more psychoactive, and the Cannabis indica subtype is even more psychoactive than that. But there's some taxonomic confusion. There's some confusion in classification of cannabis. So in effect, that means that the sativa, in some books, when they're talking about Cannabis sativa species, they're actually talking about Cannabis indica. So for reliable, powerful, psychoactive, that's mind affecting, and medicinal effects, the indica subtype is preferable, or a sativa which is guaranteed to have a certain level of THC. So now we're getting into the pharmacology. So in other words, you need to get your cannabis from someone who knows about it, from a reputable supplier who can guarantee the levels of active constituents in the plant. So what are those active constituents? The main psychoactive or mind-affecting constituent in cannabis is delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which is delta-9 THC is for short, or just THC, which is the main, its properties. It has multiple properties, but it's actually responsible for most of the noticeable medicinal properties. So it is the component which reduces nausea. It's the component which increases appetite. It's the component that reduces pressure in the eye, which makes it relevant for glaucoma. It's the component that reduces spasticity. It's the component that reduces nerve pain. So in other words, most of the medicinal properties of cannabis are largely attributable to THC. However, there are a bunch of other compounds in the plant. In fact, there are over 400, or depending which paper you read, over 500 different cannabinoids in cannabis. In other words, THC, or delta-9 THC, is just one of up to 500 different similar compounds. Some of those other compounds have been classed as CBD, or cannabidiols for short, and they actually counterbalance the effect of the THC. Their effect, they tend not to have much of an effect on the mind. What effects they do have, largely sedative or calming, anti-anxiety. THC is the bit that gets you high, but in high doses can actually produce anxiety and also hallucinations. And the cannabidiols, the CBD, tend to offset that and calm it down. The cannabidiols also have interesting effects both in the nervous system and in the immune system. And there are two different types, well, more than two different types, but two main types of receptors on cells that have been identified. Receptors are just sort of little proteins on the surface of cells that pick up particular chemicals, or which particular chemical messengers attach to. And it's been found that the cannabidiols in cannabis attach to two different receptor subtypes called CB1 and CB2. And the CB1 subtype is mainly found in the nervous system, mainly, and the CB2 subtype is mainly found in cells of the immune system and also the immune system in the gut. It's not quite that simple, but that's a sort of overview. And those cannabinoids in cannabis, the CBD so-called, by interacting with those receptors, modulate or help to alter inflammatory processes and immune processes. The net effect of cannabis on the immune system actually appears to be slightly suppressive. It seems to reduce immune activity somewhat, which may be one reason, in addition to the THC's anti-spasticity effect, why it's beneficial in multiple sclerosis, for example, because in MS, it's an autoimmune condition that affects the nervous system. So the THC will reduce spasticity and symptoms of MS, and the cannabinoids will help to potentially slow down progression a little bit by reducing the immune response. So anyway, that's a bit of an overview, and those are the two main groups of compounds. Other things to say about those compounds: they are not water soluble, they are fat soluble. That's important for two reasons. It's important practically because when you're taking cannabis, if you are taking any oral solution or any solution where you're applying it to your body, it doesn't apply if you're smoking it because you're vaporizing everything then. You're making an inhalable version of it. But if you're applying it in a liquid, or say in a suppository or in a cream, if you use water as a base, for example, if you tried to make a cannabis tea, it's not going to have much of an effect because most of those compounds don't dissolve in water. So that's a practical consideration. The other reason that's important is because any fat-soluble substance or drug tends to hang around in the system for longer. So its effects, not only is it detectable in the system for a long time, but its effects do linger.